Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Andrew Fleck Children's Services annual community meeting. This is our first opportunity to do our community meeting virtually, but it's certainly not our first virtual meeting, as I'm sure many of you have become very experienced at this kind of a format. My name is Kim Hiscott, and I'm the Executive Director. And we have two special people with us this evening that I will introduce in a few minutes. And we are very excited about the interactive conversation that we're going to be able to have tonight. You will see on your screen that there was an opportunity for you to start to ask questions of Shannon and Brad. And in the meantime, because we were able to offer this opportunity virtually, we extended the invitation across Ontario. So if you are from outside of Ottawa and would like to let us know where you are listening to us and watching us from, we would really appreciate having a sense of who is with us tonight. So very quickly, I'm just going to give you an overview of Andrew Fleck Children's Services and what we accomplished in 2019. So in 2019 was an interesting year for us. Seems like now a million years ago, given I think that all of us feel the last 3 months has been like 3 years and 3 months. But in 2019, we continue to focus on our strategic plan. And our strategic plan has three directions for us to focus on. And that includes expanding in response to growing demand and unmet needs, developing our capabilities and enhancing our services to ensure accessible, client-centered, high-quality care, and engaging with other early learning and family service stakeholders to promote an effective coordinated response to community needs. So by the end of 2019, we were able to significantly fulfill all three of those directions by welcoming 6 programs to Andrew Fleck Children's Services. And that includes Sunflower, Wellington, Capital, Colonel By Childcare Centres, as well as Riverside Park Nursery School and the Ottawa Forest and Nature School. This means that now on a daily basis, we are providing an early learning experience for over 1,600 children, including those in our home childcare program. While new to us, each of these programs brought with them a rich culture and practice of providing quality experiences with a commitment to children, families, and each other. We embraced their histories and shared our own with the message that together we are stronger. Growth and learning was a theme for all of our programs in 2019. So for example, our Children's Inclusion Support Services team expanded to 28 consultants and 4 behavior consultants and supported 703 children. They focus on supporting educator development, including preparing and presenting new professional learning opportunities with a unique focus on school-age programs, which of course has continued during this time. They provided lots of virtual supports during this time while we've been closed. We were thrilled to be one of the agencies chosen by the City of Ottawa to continue to offer early learning services in Ottawa Central South, albeit with a slightly reduced mandate that reduced our ability to offer services in French. Our home childcare program has continued to offer self-employed providers 2 options, either our full service or what we call our traditional model, where we collect parent fees, or our administrative model for providers who wish to deal with this aspect of their business independently. Our 130 plus providers are dedicated to the children and families in their community, welcoming children into their homes and providing much needed flexible options and alternate hours of care. So overall, 2019 was our transition year from a medium-sized organization to a large one. This was particularly obvious at our agency-wide fall meeting, where the large room was filled and the enthusiasm was palpable as we shared our upcoming adventures. The opportunities created by our growth have been significant and positive. And a sincere thank you to everyone, including our partners, who share this adventure with us. And traditionally, our agency, during our agency meeting, or our community-wide meeting, I should say, we also have, we also typically host it in partnership with the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, and I wanted to thank them because once again this year they did offer us the opportunity to have our meeting at their location, but of course it ended up being that needed to be virtual this year. So in 2019, here's a very quick review of who we served and what we offered, and so we're particularly proud of the fact that we were able to support 4,500 children and 3,400 families. So that's a quick overview of what we've been doing at Andrew Fleck Children's Services in 2019. But now I'd like to talk about or like to welcome two people who are colleagues and who I've gotten to know quite well over the last year or so, who are going to engage in a conversation. We're going to try to keep this really natural, have an interesting flow. They're going to share their experiences, and we really hope that you will provide lots of questions, and we will be doing our very best to answer them as we're talking. So first I'm going to ask them both a question. So I'm going to start with Brad. And the question is, describe your experiences in the early years sector, Brad, and why you are passionate about the work you do.
Thanks so much, Kim. You know, for me, I'm very engaged with education in general. That has been my background in various different settings over the years. And so the chance to work at Makonsag and be able to expand our center and our overall programming in the past year has really given me the chance to explore that passion of building opportunities for you know, our communities and Indigenous children throughout the Ottawa region, and be able to build up our pride in our nations and our ability to really engage in our culture and our practices in a space that is our own and is led by you know, our educators, and is led by an Indigenous team that really allows us to you know, experience and build a vision of childcare that's culturally safe and engaged.
Thank you, Brad. That's great. And so Shannon, same question for you. Just give us a little bit of a sense of your background and why you are passionate about the early years sector.
Thank you, Kim. Sago, everyone, zooming in from Niagara Falls. It's very interesting how my path has come here. And talk about it probably for a long time, but I will try to do it in a short time. So I went to actually Mohawk College to take my early childhood education. And it was there that they had identified and recognized that I was Indigenous. And recommended that I go to a Head Start program in Hamilton, Nawasa Head Start program. It was there that I was actually first connected to my culture and began the journey to reconnect with my actual identity and understanding who I was. It was the 2.5-year-olds sitting in a circle who had taught me smudge and taught me about love and taught me about family. And it was through that culture that of seeing how our Indigenous communities came together to raise a child and support identity with the young ones, that I went to move on and work with women's services in the VAW sector, violence against women. Spent some time there, and at that time I said, we need to help our men. So I started working with our Indigenous men in homelessness and addictions. And then from there, I went to our youth. And at that time, those youth were the children that I taught at 2.5, that were now reconnecting with them as young adults. And it was through that, seeing their strength and their identity, their confidence of who they were, and to see how they were still immersed in the community, the Indigenous community, and involved, that an opportunity became through the Ministry of Education for the Centers of Excellence. And it really hit home to me how important those early years are and the great impact that we have as educators, as helpers, that we really help form those identities and healthy self of awareness. So that is where my passion is, because it's in these next generations that I get to see that healing and support a community that fosters our Indigenous ways of knowing and being.
Thanks, Shannon. That was great. So we invited people here tonight, suggesting that we could be on the non-Indigenous community could be on a walk beside the Indigenous community, and that we are on a journey together. But really, what do we mean when we say that? Maybe we'll start with Shannon. Shannon's not even going to get a chance to take a sip of water. We're going to start with Shannon and say, so Shannon, when we say that, well, what do we really mean? What is that going to look like? And then as soon as you're done, we'll let Brad jump right in.
So it is a big question. And I think what I'm going to offer is that there's not one answer. There's not one way. What I'm going to say is that walking together is just that, visually on all levels, if not physically, mentally, spiritually, and emotionally, that we are side by side with all of our allies, with all of our nations, that we hold each other in spaces that are non-judgmental, unbiased, and promote the gifts that we each carry. Not trying to take those gifts for our own knowledge, but supporting those with those gifts and holding them up in that manner. Allowing Indigenous people to be Indigenous people, having our ways of knowing and being in our world views, supporting that and allowing us to not always have to validate those reasons for that, but walking with that and then being able to share your own identities and cultures. And I'm going to stop there because I know this is probably going to become a part where me and Brad play off of one of another. So I'm going to invite Brad to share in that beginning piece.
Yeah, I think in relation to that, the thing that comes to my mind in terms of like building towards that, to journeying together, is really thinking about how, how varied the Indigenous experience is, and how our deep traditions and practices and worldviews come out of a set of experiences that are not uniform. We don't have a singular pan-Indigenous experience, but we have our own, distinctions that we're often placed in terms of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. But that even breaks down further into nation-based and regionally specific, like, characters of Indigenous peoples in our communities. And so to journey together then, I think, means that we need to build that kind of understanding with the folks that we're journeying with, to really understand that those teachings and ways of being come from specific contexts and ideals that each of our nations hold and need to be engaged with respectfully and in a way that respects that differentiation between ourselves, so that we can all kind of engage together and learn about the specific practices and ways of knowing and being that bring us to the place that we are today.
Thanks, Brad. And I appreciate both of you saying that it is big, and it's not just, there's not just one conversation about this. I think that that's the most important piece that we can think about, right? Is that we need to be having lots of conversations and trying to understand multiple different perspectives. And I really appreciate you also identifying pan-Indigenous, and I think that there's a risk there, where an unintentional risk perhaps, where we do think that there's just one, that Indigenous means Indigenous and that's the same for everybody. So I appreciate that you pointing out that there are lots of differences, and we need to be aware of that and recognize that. So to continue along this sort of path of the conversation, and people are starting to put in questions, and that's great. I think that we have about 145 people or so that are watching, and so if people have questions, we really welcome them. But I'll keep going with mine because I have lots too. So from your perspective, what would you say is meant by reconciliation? So truth and reconciliation, they feel like heavy words, and I think we want to do right by those heavy words. But what does that really mean, and what would it look like in the early years? So Brad, did you want to start?
Yeah, I can start with that one. And I think, raising the phrasing of the word around truth and reconciliation is important. There are lots of deep and important truths about the history of this land and the ways in which Indigenous communities have been treated in all aspects of the educational system and a whole host of other areas, of our society, and the way that we've been engaged with by a whole host of forces therein, right? But I think that for me, I think that the idea of reconciliation, at least from my perspective, is that we, like, our communities, need deep connection and need to be able to sustain our own connections to land and community. We need to have the space to do that. And so for us, I think in an early years context, it's to promote that cultural safety in programs and to ensure that there's opportunities for a culturally safe training program, even for educators, to ensure that folks who want to engage in the early learning sector have the ability to do so. It's something that, through Makonsag and through folks both locally here in Ottawa and provincially, is something that we often talk about is ensuring that there's space in programs for our voices and for the experiences of our children and families. Now, that's a holistic kind of approach that I think we'd be looking for as various communities. And I think that whole child, whole family, whole community approach is the kind of perspective that Indigenous folks and Indigenous educators and Indigenous families bring to the table. And so for reconciliation to occur in that kind of context, there has to be an openness to those things. And I think that, we're very lucky that amongst our partners, I think that we have those roads to walk together. But that is, I think, at least the starting point for me, is to provide the openness to those sorts of things.
Thank you. And Shannon, I know you've got some things to say here, which is just great.
I think Brad did a wonderful job. And I think when I think of truth and reconciliation for myself, I think the biggest part is before we can get to reconciliation, we really need to sit with those truths. We really need to fully understand those truths, and not just something. I'm going to ask people to not just read it, but actually feel it. Look at how that would impact a family. How did it impact a family 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and how does it presently have impacts on a family today? I think that is one of the biggest things in misconceptions is we have to start looking at the intergenerational trauma that is there and how it may be lying in some of our families. We have such wonderful programs, and being with the little ones, we can start to create those safe spaces that they can build their identities. And by that, I mean is build that inner fire. We all carry a sacred fire within us. So what we want to do is, how do we fan that child's fire? How do we fan that parent's fire and that family's fire, like Brad said, and that community's fire? What part are we playing as we stand around that circle? That means that there's people that are bringing wood to the fire. There's people that are literally fanning it. There's people that are watching it and keeping caution there. And I think that is a huge thing, is that there is space for all of us to support that with our families, with our children, and with our communities. And that we're not ever just the child, that a child is all of those ancestors and members that stand beside them. So looking at ways to understand that history, and that history is not that far ago, because there's still a lot of things that are presently happening today that families are still struggling with. So once we can understand and emphasize that we're not sympathizing, we understand and we validate those truths to be true for those families and their experience. And that's where reconciliation starts, is through that kinship. And to me, when I look at reconciliation, it's building kinship. And we do that by sitting with one another to make a personal connection, because when we make those connections over tea, over water, over apple juice, over a playground, just playing with the blades of grass, we make a connection that binds us, that we have that meaningful interactions. And that is reconciliation. For me, is meaningful intentions and interactions, because sometimes it becomes a slippery slope where cultural appropriation can happen, where in meaning to do well, we can still do harm. And by that is when we start doing for or doing things without that person beside us, without that grandmother beside us, that nokom standing there, or that parent or auntie. So I think it's a big task, and it's a journey, but it's a journey we take together. But in order to journey together and walk a path together, we have to sit and we have to build kinship with one another so that we can truly understand. And that is where we build trust and respect, that we listen to each other and we can hear the questions that are coming from another person, and then being able to speak to the heart for sharing back what that truth looks like for that family. So, and that can be done with the children, is just by those times that we sit and we ask them how they're feeling about something. What does it mean to them to put their feet into that grass? Because to them, it may start to mean when they start to go pick those medicines. So it's listening to those little ones too, that they are on the same equal part, that we don't have a hierarchy. Those children are our teachers, just as the aunties, the uncles, the parents, and the community are.
Wow, that was great. That's a lot. I think that I was writing down pieces as you were saying it. I think I feel like I need to unpack it, and I wonder people who have joined us maybe feel the same way. You said, like, not just read it but feel it, and I think that's a really good advice as a good start. I think we all have a responsibility to read the Truth and Reconciliation document, but not just read it, but to actually feel it. So I appreciate that. That's a really good starting point. Brad, you also mentioned the word cultural safety, and so I thought maybe we could just backtrack just a little bit and see if you can help us define what do you mean by cultural safety?
So what I mean there is is a space that is safe in which to express one's cultural experience, to be able to unpack one's experiences in community and feel safe to share in practices and traditions and teachings that reflect that community. And I think that, one of the things that's, I think, really important to our program and to, all of our, partners in the Indigenous community here in Ottawa and around the province is providing that place where, our little ones can really experience that in a way that they can feel comfortable and grow and learn together and experience that, like I said earlier, in a holistic kind of way, without the fear or concern of, that being infringed on or limited in some way by folks who may or may not understand the significance of those kinds of things in a child's life and in all of our lives. I mean, I think we all feel that in our community in terms of being able to fully express parts of our culture. And, I think that being able to have that space and freedom, especially in spaces that are led by ourselves, where our voices can guide those processes, is really important.
That's great. That helps a lot. Thank you. So Shannon, in one of the conversations you and I had pretty early on when I first met you, you were defining for me how you embraced, or what you thought, how allyship could be embraced. And that resonated with me. I think it's a really impactful word. So first of all, I guess, help us to explain, if you could explain what allyship means to you. And then, is it also possible to be well-meaning and then still cause harm?
Yeah, I think so. I started to touch a little bit about it is, so when we talk about truth and reconciliation, I really started to feel I struggled with it sometimes, the language, because it sometimes spoke that, like, there's this problem and this needs to be fixed and we need to come fix it together. And I've tried to really sit with different words like that. And allyship sat with me in a much deeper way, because allyship to me is shoulder to shoulder, that we support one another in each other's own identities, that we allow each other to be who we are, but it is a mutual exchange. And by that is that oftentimes what we see sometimes, and what has happened in the past, is that tokenism can happen, that we just start to invite one Indigenous person, whether it's an ED from here or an elder from here, but we're not mindful that that elder is also being pulled to several other communities and several other meetings. But allyship to me would mean, what are we giving back also to that speaker? So for instance, if we had Makonsag presenting somewhere, how are you then supporting Makonsag? Are you going to their opening? Are you going to their family gathering times? So that it is a mutual exchange of energies. It's a mutual ask and give of each other, in that we're trusting each other and wanting to learn from each other in a space that is safe. That our questions are, and I'm going to use the word ignorance. To me, ignorance is not a bad word. Ignorance is, for what it is that we don't know something until we know something. So the part of that is that we need to be okay in the truth that we may not know something, or that we may have been taught something in a way that was not true. So what we can do with that is saying, I'm unsure about this. I was told to offer tobacco, or I was told that I need to give a gift, but being okay with and feeling safe on both sides, so that the Indigenous person and the non-Indigenous person both feel safe in a space that they can ask those questions of one another, that we are learning this together, and that many Indigenous people are on really large different paths in their own healing and own understanding. I share for myself, up till 5 years ago, I never would have said I was part of intergenerational trauma. I know this not to be true now. I know that I'm the perfect storm, because I didn't know where I was from. I don't have I have my name now, but there were many things I did not know of myself, and one of those is even my language. But there are many, many stories, because people have been impacted by these traumas in various ways. So allyship, I think, again, is kinship. It means that it is a relationship that is mutual to both people sitting and coming together, but that you both have responsibility to feeding that relationship. And if you think of it as a garden, we're all going to take part in watering that seed and tending to that soil and taking care of that soil, and allow that seed to be those next generations. But as a community, we're all going to come to that garden to take care of that. And we wouldn't go to that garden and say, you're a rose, or no, now you're corn. But we're going to promote that seed to be what it is. And maybe that seed is tobacco. So we want to guide that in that way. And it's allyship to me. I think I could talk for days, because it's a beginning and it's a journey. But what I'll say is it's something that is mutually for both, that both people feel that they can sit there and that it is a respectful relationship, and that they can go to each other, that we're not just taking something we need, a piece of information, without putting something back into that.
That helps. And the garden analogy actually is very helpful. That's impactful. But yes, a very good point. Sometimes we do, maybe, because we're enthusiastic, we go and ask, and we have an expectation that the Indigenous community is going to give and educate us, and we're not necessarily giving back. And so I think, yes, being respectful and maintaining that mutual relationship is really key. So along those lines, I'm going to jump to Brad. Unless, Brad, you had something you want to add to what Shannon just said, because I didn't give you a chance.
It's all good. I think the one thing that sticks in my mind, and I just to build off of where Shannon was at with that, and kind of tying back into some of the things that I was mentioning earlier, is that like that question of how that mutual relationship also then goes back to like Shannon was mentioning, this idea of being like, often called on as like the one Indigenous voice in a space, you know, sometimes to represent, you know, our nations, like myself as a Mi'kmaq person, or First Nations folks, or Inuit folks, or Métis folks in general, or just being the one Indigenous person in the space. It can be absolutely taxing, and especially so, as Shannon referred back to for our elders. I think that really to have allyship also then comes back to the idea of understanding the differences and context around our nations, and how you know, those experiences can be very different depending on who you're speaking to, and the teachings and ideals that they hold with them. And you know, it can differ, be it on a nation to nation kind of basis, on a distinction sort of level, or even you know, surrounding the experiences of the urban Indigenous community specifically. So I think like being able to have that understanding, and coming forward with that humility and respect when approaching allyship is always really important, so that we come to understand each other in the contexts that we're in.
Yeah. I also say too is that, I think you've heard us say a couple times already, is that there isn't just one answer. You know, it's always, so sometimes if you're reaching out to Indigenous organizations, it does take time, because those individuals may be going back to their teachers, their knowledge keepers, and bringing it back to their community. So I think it's being mindful of what are those protocols within your local region, for that community. How can we support if you're asking a knowledge keeper, an elder to come? Sometimes they have helpers. Sometimes they are the caregiver for other little ones. If you're asking of ceremony and things like this, that means they're going to pick medicine. So there's all these things that kind of, and I think that's where we kind of say, if we're sitting with one another, then you can start to learn what the roles and responsibilities are that each individual carries, and how we can help with those things. So can we bring families out to go help the elder or the knowledge keeper with the harvest, or when we harvest our own berries, are we giving back some to the families, so that they're going home with them to take care of them? If it's someone you have on your board or coming regularly, especially with this COVID, we've been checking in with our elders to make sure that they have those things that they need. So I think the biggest thing is, and understanding that the roles and responsibilities are different, so different, for each nation, and so being okay that sometimes we'll stumble. I stumble all the time with my protocols still, but being humble that it's okay and it's an opportunity to learn, and you're just going to continue to add to that bundle of knowledge.
Exactly. And I think it's also too, just like, you know, think about how you would build a relationship with people in your life, and how you would want to be spoken to in terms of, you know, gathering teachings and knowledge. You don't just knock someone's door down to learn something from them. You build that relationship in a genuine and with humility to be able to do that. So I think that if those are the kinds of principles, like I think Shannon and I are both saying, that you're coming forward with, even if you make a mistake or trip as you go along, we're all learning about each other in the way that we want to build these relationships together.
Thanks for that. And I'm noticing some questions, which is great. So people want to keep sending questions, and then we will get to them in a minute. So Brad, this is one for you though. So I think many of us have an appreciation for the Indigenous culture, and recognizing, of course, that it's quite vast, right? The different nations have their own unique aspects. And so some of us want to embrace different aspects, but how does cultural appreciation differ from cultural appropriation? And how do we make sure that we don't cross that line? I'll get Brad to start, and then Shannon can jump in after.
Yeah, so I think for me, it comes back to those ideas of understanding and respect fundamentally. To avoid appropriation, I think you have to be willing to take direction from the specific Indigenous folks that you're speaking to about their specific teachings, and understand without taking on a sense of being excluded, like where the lines are in each of those contexts. And that can vary by the teaching and by the nation and the kind of part of our culture that we're talking about. But I think it really comes down again to that notion of you really have to get to know people, you have to get to know the communities that you're speaking about, and really come to understand what aspects of our cultures mean to us and what that kind of engagement means to us. You know, it's like if something is of deep importance to our peoples and to our nations, you know, for someone to just go ahead and, even if in an enthusiastic way, say, you know, I really just wanted to do this and I wanted to experience this for myself, and I wanted to, burn some sage or build a dream catcher or what have you, without having the teachings and experiences and like engaging with those things in a real, genuine way, that can only cause hurt. And I think that, you know, a lot of folks in our community are really open to teaching folks about what the lines are in their particular context for their particular nation, in their particular community, and where those things can be. But I think it comes from a place of listening and a place of care and a place of humility that, you know, has to be at the center, I think, of all relationship building. And I think that includes how we engage with avoiding cultural appropriation. Ultimately, it really does come down to just listening.
And that's so true and so good. I was just like, oh, can I record it? It's probably one of the top questions we always get asked, but it's a very important question. And I think it should be at the beginning of all discussions, because I think this is where mishaps happen. This is where harm is caused, but in a well-meaning way was the intention, but unfortunately became unharmful. And I think that really comes from, we tend to want to be fixers. So we're like, oh, this did not make me feel good, so I want to make it better, and I want to try to do this because it's going to mean that I've done my part. But if we are operating in a place that I have done this, then we are not operating in allyship, because it should be, we have done this. I have done this with this family or with this community. When I think of appreciation is giving that acknowledgement back to, I had an experience and it left me very emotional. It left me very touched. It changed views that I had, and that's appreciation. It is sharing your own experience that you may have had, and then suggesting to others to say, you may really want to go and listen to this person. You may want to reach out to so-and-so. Or have you considered watching this documentary? Appropriation, I'm going to say the internet plays a big role in quickly appropriating things. But appropriation is something on behalf of our communities, that you're incorporating something because you had seen it somewhere and thought, I'm going to add this in. But what I'm going to suggest with this is if you can keep in mind that teachings come with all of those things, such as dream catchers, such as smudging. We don't just pick those things up. That comes with a lot of time spent with knowledge keepers or others, of listening to the teachings, because each of those things comes with roles and responsibilities. So when we pick those things up, we are also carrying roles and responsibilities to taking care of those things, such as a medicine wheel, and such as a dream catcher. A dream catcher is our medicine. So there's ways to handle these things that we need to take care of them so that they don't cause harm. A good example too is People are often drawn to say, I want an eagle feather, or I want a feather, or we're going to give feathers. Feathers are a big honor to have, but what I will say is they come with one of the largest responsibilities. And once you're given an eagle feather and they start to kind of tell you all the responsibilities that come with that, you're very quickly thinking, oh, this is a big thing that I'm taking on. And so that's where we kind of say is, if we start to glamorize these things, it loses the intentions of the teachings that come with that. And that's where our when we think of pedagogies and epistemologies and even like the ontologies, we're looking at the roots of these things, that it's never just a drum that's beating. The drum is beating to cause healing, to cause discussion, but that drum has also come together with many ceremonies before that drum came to that classroom or came to that person. So when we talk about culturally safe spaces, is being open to those discussions too, to hear that, spirit is in these. So how are we caring for these? And how are they kept? And are they being placed on a wall? Or so I think it's appreciate, and please never stop appreciating and coming and learning, but sit with it, feel it, listen to it, and see how it impacts your life, and then become that ally and that voice that encourages others to follow that same path to do that, and allow those that have those teachings be lifted in that gift of carrying that message and carrying those teachings, and allow them to continue to provide those teachings on. And sometimes those teachings will come from the children as well. So we need to allow them that space to carry that we don't interrupt that, but allow them, because we have Autumn, a water walker that started at the age of 13 and an age of 11. And she had a mighty voice at the UN at a young age. And very easily could have been, oh, you're just younger. So we really want to create those spaces and appreciate, please. And appropriation, the quickest thing is if you're doing something that does not belong to your own beliefs and culture and identity.
That was great. That was gave us a lot of food for thought. I'm sure a lot of people are trying to process them, because I think that it probably does come from a place of awe, a place of wanting to honor, and not necessarily understanding the harm or the impact. And so I think that was very much appreciated by me, and I'm sure by everybody who was listening. So here's one of the questions that is in the chat that I think is interesting. It comes from our own, one of our own Ottawa Forest and Nature School, probably one of the educators or the team lead, I'm not sure. So they've asked, what are your thoughts? So Shannon and Brad, and I'll let you to decide who's going to speak first. What are your thoughts regarding programs on the land, specifically for Indigenous children, compared to programs that Indigenous children take part in that are open to families from other backgrounds? So what would your thoughts be on that?
I think when it comes to the lands, it's all of our land. We all have connections with it. So I think it's creating a space that we can hear from any diverse family or background that may be there, is to pose a question to say, what do your lands look like? Do your lands look like this? And that Indigenous family may or may not share what their lands look like. Being in Ottawa, they don't really look like how they traditionally did. So I think it would be a really interesting discussion to have with families, to hear that maybe, and I've heard this from my Inuit colleagues when we were recently planning an outing out in Ottawa, and we were like, oh, this forest is beautiful. And they're like, we don't have trees. And, and this is what I mean by we still make mistakes humbly too. And so we quickly were like, okay, how do we create lands that will represent for all of us, and exploring those? But I think it's always asking those families how they connect with those lands. Depending where they come from, those lands may look like marsh, those lands may look like the woods, or they may look like an urban setting and having a blade of grass come out in between the pavement cracks. but they may speak of the sky then, or they may speak of the rocks. So I think that's something that goes back to the families, but I don't think we isolate that. I think we create the space to reflect on what lands look like to each of us.
Yeah, I think Shannon, you nailed it exactly. And I think that like looking at like our experience here in Ottawa, like our process has been to build you know, a more land-based program here in Ottawa through Makonsag, and working with folks at the Child and Nature Alliance, and with folks at the Forest and Nature School, which, you know, I've been really lucky to spend time, you know, in your spaces and to be able to see that environment. And one of the really wonderful things about being out there when we were out there is we had a chance to also have elders from the area with us and to speak about teachings that were, you know, rooted in the area itself, and connected to their experiences here in this community. And I think that for folks in this area, or in you know, areas wherever you are, I think that it's important to really connect back with the local community here, and to make space for folks in your spaces and in your programs, and where, you know, there's opportunities for Indigenous-led programs to exist and to flourish, to support those as best you can through, you know, allyship and listening, as we've spoken about prior. I think that kind of relationship building can be really critical and build something really beautiful for our communities, but I think for everyone to be able to engage with. You know, I think that that's the real beauty of the process that we've been you know, and the road that we've been walking along with our various partners in the city, including Andrew Fleck, and it's been a really great way to build that together. So I think that being able to draw on those areas, while also having that kind of culturally safe kind of space, that rootedness to the land, is something that you know, in our context, I think is really important. And I think that we have the ability to build together.
I really like that, the ability to build together. And I think that that's particularly important in our urban Ottawa setting, where we know that there are a lot of families that have an Indigenous background, Indigenous heritage, who maybe don't choose to identify. And that's their choice, obviously. But maybe if there was an opportunity to build together, maybe they would feel. And, you know, Shannon, you sort of you explained that was your experience, right? That you weren't able, or not weren't identifying as an Indigenous woman until you became an adult and had an opportunity, and it felt like the right time for you. So wouldn't it be great if we also, as the early years sector, really supported it being the right time for families whenever they're ready for it to be the right time? I don't know, Shannon, if you want to add something to that before I get to the next question.
No, I think it's good. I think, again, with each of these, I always just think there's days and weeks and teachings around each of these. So, which makes it exciting. And I think that's what I would say is just, if you have the opportunity to attend Indigenous-led programs on the lands, you can hear the language that's being used and the relationships that are being carried forward. And then it's an amazing opportunity, because it does cause pause a lot of the time to think, how quickly have I walked past that, or maybe missed that opportunity that I'm being caused to pause and reflect. So
yes, and of course, unfortunately, COVID caused us to have a pause, where we had an amazing opportunity planned for Ottawa that I know people were really excited to experience. And then we had Shannon and her team had to make the right decision that it wasn't the right time, but hopefully it'll be another opportunity to come back for us at some point. So one of our final questions, kind of a wrap-up question, because it's a pretty big one. So do you have any approaches or resources, anything else that you would suggest that the non-Indigenous community could start to utilize or embrace I suspect you're going to suggest that it's not just a one and done, and we can talk about what that means. But if you have other ideas, some ways that we could be respectful as we continue on this journey together. But we start with Brad.
Sure. I mean, I think for me, the way that I think about it is I think all of our nations and peoples, as well as I can think of it, it's that we all think about, I think, early childhood development and early learning as a holistic process, as a process that includes the whole family, and as I said earlier, the whole community. And so when we're looking at resources that folks can draw on and learn from, there are a whole host of Indigenous organizations here in Ottawa, even outside the early learning sector, that surely have teachings and learnings and ways of knowing that could be helpful and inform the ways that folks go about their practice and their programs and their ways of going about things. But as I think Kim, you rightly said, there isn't a single way in which to approach this. And I think that there's a lot of different ways that our communities engage and interact. And I think that, for example, like, we as Indigenous service organizations in the city have the Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition and have our Indigenous Early Years Circle that have a whole host of really holistic experiences and ways in which we engage in things here, well beyond just our sector, but in a whole host of other areas that intersect, and I think that's the part that I really stick with, is the idea that whatever approach that folks lead down, and whomever you build relationships with that kind of humble way, you're going to quickly find that there are really a whole host of interconnected pieces that really represent, I think, how we see community in our communities. And so once we get to that point, I think that's the central kind of way into understanding, I think, and getting rolling with these kind of approaches.
Great. And Shannon, did you want to add some more pieces?
Sure. I think, again, a wealth of resources is Bradley and his team and the Indigenous Advisory Circle that already exists in Ottawa, and making those connections and starting to learn what their community calendars are, so that you could be supporting their events as well, so that that kinship can start to be built. And these discussions can be had in Ottawa as to what does this look like for your own community? What is the local knowledge within Ottawa? And being representative of many nations in Ottawa, how are we supporting our Inuit, our Algonquin, our Métis, in that? How are we supporting the families and starting to learn who our families are and their interests, and even our staff members? And what are those gifts that they have that you can incorporate their knowledges into your center? Is there lacrosse players that they could come and share? Just storytellers in general, being able to share that way. But most importantly is, what are the values and the principles within your community to support the child? What values do we want to pass on to build self-esteem and to build self-awareness that support an identity that is in a culturally safe space? That is it having different books that are reflective on the bookshelf that speak of Nokomis, that they can say, I have a Nokomis too. Or Sweet Kulu, I think, is the other book where it's an Inuit lullaby. But that we're not teaching, say, the 7 grandfathers' teachings, because that's not necessarily ours to give, but that we can have materials that may be familiar, that a child may interact with differently, and share their knowledge around that, and really building that self-awareness for them. A really great read is starting to read The Truth and Reconciliation if you haven't read, recognizing that that is written from the perspective of residential schools. So you would want to also read the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women report that was released last year as well, which would speak again from one lens, starting to learn what the relationship is with the 60 scoop and what we now call the millennial scoop with child and family services and those impacts. And like Brad said, really venture out into those other sectors. A really great resource that I stand by is through the Homelessness Sector, which is the Indigenous definition of homelessness, because it shares 10 pillars as to how one may be disconnected from identity and culture. So when you start to kind of read those impacts, it kind of gives you a different light also as to creating an environment that supports that. Those, how are we connecting back to acknowledge the lands that are here, the families that are here, the makeup of the families, and just starting to look at the different language, the use of language, being okay to talk about spirit, and recognizing for us, spirit is not a religion, but spirit is the speaking of energy of what something may carry. But that is through sitting with individuals local in your community, such as Bradley, and such as the Indigenous Advisory Circle, and many other centers that are out in Ottawa that I know are eager to always be able to sit down, have tea, show their program, and speak of what they're doing, and also speak of the help and support that they're needing, because we can't all sit at the same tables, but it's important that we are standing there as allies to say, you know, Bradley wasn't at this meeting. We need to make sure that someone's reaching out here, or Stephanie from the Inuit Center was not here. How can we reach back out to get that information back to her as well?
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Brad, were you going to say something?
Yeah, and I think just to tie back into something that Shannon said near the start, it really comes back to that sense of reciprocity and mutual relationship as well, right? I think it also comes to the idea of, you know, as you learn and share in knowledge, I think it's also really important to tie that back to supporting Indigenous educators in your center and their professional development and their growth, so that, you know, the learning and knowledge and those pieces are not a one way, but as a part of a broader process. You know, one of the great things about building our center, our newest center, is that we've had that experience and had the ability to do a whole host of training with the non-Indigenous and Indigenous educators to grow together. And I think that those kinds of pieces tied together really build strong centers and strong communities.
That's great. I'm amazed by both of you, I have to say. What you contributed this evening was exactly what I was hoping, and definitely what I was feeling that I needed, particularly I think based on the experiences that we've all lived through in the last week or so, and you know how we've been able to hopefully start some conversations. Horrific experience in the U.S., but it has generated a willingness, I think, for conversations. And so I thought I might just ask if either of you had any final thoughts. You've given us lots and lots to think about, but if you have any final thoughts, in particular as we're thinking about what has been happening and how we make sure that conversations don't just end, that they actually continue, that it's the beginning of conversations.
I think my biggest learning, I think, and advice is to be okay to be uncomfortable. It's a very vulnerable position to be in. I don't think anyone is asking for us to admit wrongs, but we're asking for us to be open to understanding truths that may be currently being experienced by our families and by ourselves. And so, as uncomfortable as you may feel, we are equally as uncomfortable and scared in doing this, because history has not always gone in a very positive way. So we are also putting our trust and our vulnerability in sharing that what we share is in good intention and in a good way, in a good mind. And through that, we are going to stumble. We are going to say wrong things, but we can just be humble in the fact that we are learning and we are learning together, and that it's okay. And that we don't know what we don't know, but taking time to have hard discussions, uncomfortable discussions. Sometimes they're tearful because it's hard to hear some of these stories, but it's important to hear them because you're giving voice to those truths and to those families, that you're validating that you believe them and you're there for them in their journey of healing, reclaiming cultural identity, and reconciliation and allyship.
Yeah, and I think to go with that, you know, if our goal, I think, in our centers and our spaces is to build pride in our cultures, in our nations, in our differences amidst being Indigenous peoples, like here on Turtle Island, I think that, you know, the more we can spend time where, you know, others in our spaces are listening and open to the truths that we're putting forward, as Shannon says, and the experiences of our communities, the better things will be for all of our programs and spaces. I think that really it comes from that open ear and open heart to be able to engage with the things that we're putting forward, and to take that openness and the things that you hear and turn it towards a mind to how you can support and be present for our communities when you need to be, and when there are chances and opportunities to build up our educators and our families and all those spaces, to really have the openness and humility to do that in a good way, and to stand with us and to be there and to help develop these kind of paths and roads together. Ultimately, I think that's the message I think that we both kind of are carrying today. So I hope that sits with people.
I think it does. I think it does sit very profoundly with people. You know, a few of the key messages, right? Be okay to be uncomfortable. I think that's very impactful, and grow and learn together with humility. I think that's an amazing message. So thank you both very much. The hour went by very fast, but I think what we can say for sure is it's not just one conversation, it's a continued conversation, and we're very committed to being on this journey together with you. Thank you both very, very much. And good night to everyone. We will see you soon.